Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're taking an incredibly ambitious and frankly fascinating journey. We're going to unpack China's modern strategic posture. And to do that, we have to trace its evolution back through literally 5,000 years of history. We'll be looking at the cultural concepts, the historical traumas, and the dramatic ideological shifts that have fundamentally shaped how this massive global power actually operates today.
Okay, let's dive right into this. How exactly does a 5,000-year-old civilization plan for the future? It's a question that often totally stumps Western analysts. While Western strategic thinking might focus heavily on 4-year election cycles or short-term geopolitical shifts, China's perspective is deeply rooted in an ancient, continuous historical narrative. So, to really understand their modern ambitions and what that means for global geopolitics right now, we have to look through the lens of their deep past. Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to cover 6 key areas: the Middle Kingdom worldview, the century of humiliation, Mao's revolutionary discourse, the pragmatic reform era, Xi's Chinese dream, and we'll wrap it all up with China's strategic playbook.
Let's move to Section 1 and see how this all builds. The Middle Kingdom worldview. To truly grasp Chinese strategic culture, we have to start at the absolute foundation. We need a couple of linguistic anchors here. The first one is Tianxia, which translates to all under heaven. Historically, this represented a grand vision of a harmonious, interconnected world without borders, all revolving around Chinese civilization. The second term is Zhongguo, or the Middle Kingdom. Now, this isn't just a geographic label. It completely embodies the idea of China as the absolute center of the world, a place of concentrated political power and immense moral authority. Imagine viewing all of foreign policy through that specific lens. For centuries, these concepts firmly established China's self-image as the civilizational center of mankind.
And this region brilliantly illustrates where that self-sufficient worldview actually began. The ancient Huanghe or Yellow River region was the literal cradle of Chinese civilization. This is exactly where the earliest dynasties, we're talking the Xia, the Shang, and the Zhao, established themselves over 3,000 years ago. In this fertile valley, a highly advanced, technologically innovative, and largely self-sufficient civilization just flourished. When you're surrounded by what you perceive as vassal states or barbarians, well, it's pretty easy to see how that deeply ingrained belief in a culturally superior, central Middle Kingdom took root.
Moving on to Section 2, the century of humiliation.
So that ancient, supremely self-assured worldview, it was eventually shattered. Starting in 1839 with the First Opium War against Western imperial powers, a roughly 100-year span completely upended the Chinese state. Their millennia-old imperial system collapsed entirely by 1912. Territories were carved up by foreign powers, sovereignty was violently undermined, which all culminated in the brutal Sino-Japanese War. To put the sheer devastation into perspective, historians estimate that tens of millions of people perished during the internal rebellions and conflicts of this era. This 100-year period created a deeply ingrained, shared historical memory of trauma and victimization. And that memory continues to drive Chinese national identity right up to the present day.
Which brings us to Section 3, Mao's revolutionary discourse.
Rebuilding the nation after such profound devastation obviously required a massive ideological shift. Now, what's really interesting about this statement is the sheer emotional power behind it. The Chinese people have stood up. Mao Zedong delivered this famous line in September 1949, right before proclaiming the founding of the People's Republic of China. This wasn't just your standard political victory speech, it was a loud nationalist declaration that the century of humiliation was finally over. It provided immense legitimacy to the Communist Revolution by framing it as the ultimate redemption of the Chinese nation itself.
During his time in power, Mao's discourse relied really heavily on themes of victimization from foreign imperialism, the absolute need for intense revolutionary enthusiasm, and continuous class struggle. This charismatic, almost deified power discourse was incredibly effective at mobilizing the masses and completely reconstructing Chinese political culture from the ground up. However, as we know, this radical focus on constant revolution ultimately resulted in the widespread social and economic chaos of the Cultural Revolution.
All right, let's jump to Section 4, the pragmatic reform era.
Following Mao's death, the nation was just exhausted. It desperately needed stability to survive. The contrast we see here is pretty stark. Where Mao focused heavily on utopian class struggle and radical ideology, his successor, Deng Xiaoping, introduced a sharp, pragmatic turn toward economics. Deng effectively discredited the idea of continuous revolution and famously pivoted the country towards socialism with Chinese characteristics.
The new priority was crystal clear. Bring order out of all that chaos, integrate with global markets, and focus relentlessly on economic development and restoring wealth.
But to pull off this economic miracle, China absolutely needed a stable international environment. This led to Deng's famous guiding principle for foreign policy: keep a low profile and bide your time, or Taoguang Yanghui. This mindset completely defined China for decades. Through the leadership of Deng, Jiang Zemin, and Hu Jintao, China actively avoided international conflict, quietly built up its wealth, and focused internally on creating what Hu Jintao called a harmonious society. Think about how incredibly different this quiet diplomacy is from the assertive geopolitics we often see today.
And that brings us to Section 5, Xi's Chinese Dream.
So the crucial point is that this quiet phase of wealth accumulation was really always just a means to an end. This shift we're looking at here represents a drastic change in rhetoric and strategy. We've moved away from Deng's mandate to keep a low profile straight into Xi Jinping's current era of striving for achievement. This is a fundamental change in posture. With decades of immense economic and military growth now behind it, China no longer feels the need to just quietly bide its time. It is confidently signaling its intent to reclaim its historical status as a great global power.
At the very heart of this new era is Xi's signature discourse, the Chinese dream of national rejuvenation. This is a highly emotional narrative. It purposefully links the ancient greatness of the Middle Kingdom, the painful healing of the century of humiliation, and an imagined powerful future. It acts as a remarkably powerful unifying tool, sparking nationalist sentiment and justifying the modern state's ambitious goals to the wider public.
Finally, Section 6, China's Strategic Playbook.
So how do these thousands of years of culture, trauma, and ideological evolution actually dictate the military and geopolitical maneuvers we see today? Well, Western analysts often refer to China's posture as a cult of defense. Based on ancient pacifist philosophies, Chinese strategic culture perceives itself as inherently peace-loving. Their framework firmly insists on the maintenance of peace, avoiding Western-style hegemony, and crucially, only using force in self-defense. To Chinese strategists, they are absolutely not the aggressors. They see themselves as simply securing their borders against external, imperialist threats, which is a direct legacy of their historical trauma.
And this brings us to the traditional concept of Yijian, or just war. From the Chinese perspective, a war is only righteous if it is fought to secure safety or to unify the nation. What's absolutely vital to understand here is that Chinese scholars classify almost all of their military actions over the last 4,000 years, and that includes all deployments since 1949, as purely defensive measures or internal unification efforts. While the West might look at a geopolitical action and see it as offensive or expansionist, the Chinese strategic worldview categorizes it strictly as self-defense. On top of that, Chinese strategy relies incredibly heavily on the concept of Xi. Instead of just preparing for a direct, kinetic military clash, Xi involves understanding the propensity of things. It's a highly comprehensive approach to statecraft where literally every single variable, economic, diplomatic, psychological, and military, is analyzed and manipulated to maximize strategic advantage. It's all about shaping the environment so heavily in your favor that the outcome is practically decided before a single shot is ever fired. Which leads perfectly into this famous ancient stratagem from Sun Tzu: subdue the enemy without fighting. This right here remains the absolute ultimate goal of China's modern grand strategy. By combining their growing economic weight, their rapidly modernizing military, and their mastery of Xi, they're aiming to protect their expanding national interests and secure their position as a global center of power, ideally without ever resorting to open warfare.
And that brings us to the end of our explainer today. We've traced the roots of China's worldview all the way from the ancient Middle Kingdom, through revolution and reform, right up to their modern grand strategy. So I want to leave you with a thought to chew on. How does understanding this 5,000-year-long game change your view of the geopolitical headlines you read every single day? When you start seeing the world through the lens of deep history, the present starts making a whole lot more sense, doesn't it? Thank you so much for joining me today, and keep learning.